Hello, and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today, we're kicking off something we've been talking about doing for far too long, our special members only series on the fundamental ethical questions that come up all the time in superhero ethics. Now, if you're listening to this and you're not a member, you're probably thinking, what's going on? Because this is the first one of these episodes we're doing, we wanted to make it available for everyone to give you a taste of the kind of content that our members are going to get going forward. We're going to keep doing all of our awesome week-to-week episodes, but once a month, we're going to take a special time to step back from talking about one specific movie or TV show or thing, or even one specific, like very specific question, and look at what are the kind of general questions that come up again and again and again as we look at superhero media, along with all the other kind of genre media that we've expanded that to include, such as sci-fi, fantasy, chess, and kids karate, and all the like. And today we're talking about one that I think goes to the heart of so many of the things we've talked about, which is the idea of vengeance and the role that vengeance plays in our superhero and science fiction media like that. And we're talking about vengeance as a motivation for a hero, for a motivation for a villain or an anti-hero, the role, how we think about it, and things like that. And in further framing the discussion we're about to have and why we chose vengeance for this particular month, I think it's important that I kind of take a step back and talk about like why we like doing, especially I like doing this topic of superhero ethics. And part of it's because for me, like these are kind of fun trolley problems, talking about, what do you do with a superpowered person and the jail system? Or, can a person with telepathy play poker? These are fun intellectual exercises. But as I've said many times, what I love most about superheroes, about science fiction, about any of this kind of media is when it holds up a mirror to our own world. When it takes an issue from our own world and says, okay, well, let's use the context of superheroes or something like that and change things, but still, give people a chance to think about something in a new way. For example, the way, the X-Men comics have at times been a metaphor for racism or a metaphor for LGBT issues or things like that, depending on the different times it was used. So why vengeance? Late last year, we had an incident where, let me say it again. So why vengeance? I chose this one because, as a lot of us saw in the media and social media and stuff like that, when there was the murder of a prominent executive of a healthcare company, it brought up a lot of feelings for a lot of people about negative feelings about the healthcare industry. And was this a killing they were in support of or things like that? And being clear, of course, we're not supporting or condoning murder or killings or anything like that on this podcast. But it felt very interesting to me that here we had a real life example of the kind of vigilante act that we often see in our comic book and superhero media and things like that. And it gave me a chance to say, let's spend more time talking about this, especially because what I think is one of the most interesting parts of this is, are there things that we will cheer when we see a hero do or an anti-hero do that in real life we don't want to see do? Or in real life we may see them, we may cheer when that happens because we see it more as comic book media than real life, or all the complexities that go into these kind of questions. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. And I realize, I'm going to keep all that and insert that afterwards because I want to back up a second. So before we get into the particular question for today, let me kind of just start for you all. What are some of those fundamental questions that you guys think about when you think about superheroes and comic books and this kind of media? What are the kind of questions, ethical questions, that you see coming up again and again, or questions or issues or ideas or anything like that?
Well, I guess I'll start. Specifically with regards to vengeance, I would say that the biggest question that comes to my mind is who is responsible for delivering the vengeance, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like what gives them the...
So I was trying to ask about kind of other questions besides vengeance, like kind of introducing the general idea and then get to specific to vengeance. Sorry, I screwed up the order, so I was trying to back up a bit there.
Oh, okay. Well,
Let me reframe the question. So before we start talking about vengeance specifically, just kind of this general idea of this fundamental questions. What are other kind of questions that are of interest to you all, or that you see coming up again and again in the media we talk about?
Go ahead.
I mean, this is sort of related to today's topic, but one thing that I think about a lot is who gives superheroes permission to do what they do. That might not be the best way of framing it, but like what authority do they have? And is it okay that they're taking that authority on themselves? I think Civil War is a huge example of how that gets really messy. But like, there are plenty of stories where characters are going into countries that they are not citizens of and involving themselves in the politics and governance of those countries. Like, do they have a right to do that? Do they have an obligation to do that if there are human rights violations at play? Like, these are big questions, and there's a lot that we can talk about there.
For sure.
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about these things, there's a question of law, like whose laws. And even if we're just talking about human law, there are different countries. There are international organizations that are kind of conglomerates, like the United Nations, that decree things to be against the law. And yet, some people defy that, or some countries maybe are so powerful that no one can enforce the laws as they are written.
Right.
And I think a similar thing comes up especially in superhero media, because these beings are often so powerful that the humans are powerless against them. And it's like, well, you're doing stuff that is against the law, but we can't actually stop you. So I think it brings up a question of, does the law matter? Like, power makes right is a thing that comes up a lot in these situations. And that's why, like, Superman, right, when there are evil versions of Superman, like in Injustice, he's like, I'm just gonna make my own law, and people are like, well, guess that's it. We're living in a dictatorship now.
Right. Yeah. No. I think those are all great ones, and I think a lot of the questions of, do we see superheroes as metaphor for law enforcement? Do we see them as metaphor for soldiers? Do we see them as something totally different? Ties into all that. Riki, I know you often talk about the idea of whether killing should be a part of superhero media, or whether the importance of not non-lethal violence being used. And I, of course, have questions about the viability of that.
Yeah, well, for me, like, it really comes down to the media-ness of it. And this is like in anime, why I love it so much, is that Japanese anime is enjoyed by older people, but is still always like with a mind towards the younger audience. And trying to teach certain fundamental lessons. So I really enjoy that in anime, I'll just say most of the protagonists don't kill. And that's like a very clear demarcation line between, the hero and the villain in the story. And I think it's an important lesson to draw from that media and to impart upon the audience.
Right. Well, and so
I just thought of like a whole, like, I got really excited about this, but I'm just going to throw out the ethics of time travel, which is not really relevant to us, but like, should you go back and change things? Or should you not go back and change things, even if it means that a woman you love has to die? Which kind of seems like how that plot line always goes. Number 2, when the villain goes, we're not so different, you and I, which they always do. And number 3, does a superhero create supervillains? And please have me on if you do that one, because it makes me so mad.
I think it's a really good one. The vision line from Civil War of, do we invite conflict and stuff like that, which is a really good one. And to me, those also tie into, there's a thought I just had that completely escapes my brain now. Time travel and.
I mean, Matthew knows that time travel is my jam. So I'll always talk about time travel.
Yeah, well, I think it does create lots of questions, especially with the ideas of, when you have timelines, is like erasing a timeline. are you killing the people in that? And I think that comes up a lot with also things like AI, Agents of Shield, a great plot line. So yeah, there's just all these kind of great questions. And I think,
and like you were saying, very relevant to the real world.
right, exactly.
The time travel one.
Exactly. So, and it's with that relevance to the real world is why I think we're talking about vengeance today. And I think for many people, it's probably not a far grasp to find, but just kind of spell it out. I think late last year, we had the killing of a healthcare CEO that brought up a lot of feelings for a lot of people about, how do we feel about, the healthcare industry? And a lot of people not really feeling too bad about this because of those feelings or praising the person who did that. And I think, to be clear, we're not going to go into a deep analysis of all that. I think I'm pretty confident in saying all of us say that, murder is wrong, killing is wrong, but we also understand kind of the wealth of emotions that this has brought up for people. And I think for me, the reason why that's so interesting for us today is that what we saw was an act of vigilantism in the real world. We saw an act of a Punisher type, of a person who has said, for whatever reasons, like, this is someone I decided was bad, and I'm going to act on that. Kind of, Jessica, to what you were saying, like one person creating their own authority. And to me, my goal today isn't for us to decide the ethics of that. It's that I want us to discuss how those ethical questions play out in the media we discuss, because I think that helps shape how we think about these things and how we, because for me, at least, I've always been kind of fascinated that there's a lot of revenge fantasy, vengeance fantasy type things that I can find really enjoyable, even though sometimes I'd be kind of horrified of it happening in our own world. And so there's so much there to play in. And there's kind of three fundamental questions I wanted us to get into today. I'm just going to spell them out and we'll go through them one by one. And the first being like, how is vengeance a motivator for some of the characters we love? Why do we enjoy vengeance stories if we do? Which I don't want to speak for all of us. I will admit that I do at times, and sometimes I'm troubled by that. Sometimes I'm not. And then lastly, like, what are the differences between what we can enjoy on screen and what we're okay with in real life? And how do those things blend into each other? So let me first just kind of start by, let's kind of just throw some things out. What are examples you see in, we can focus mostly on superhero comic book media specifically, where vengeance is an important part of the story for a hero, a villain, an anti-hero, anyone like that. And I'll throw out the Punisher. To me, the Punisher is a great example of, there's often this kind of veneer of, I'm doing this to make the world a better place. I'm doing this to prevent these people from harming others. But also, like, Frank Castle, had his family killed and he was betrayed and he wants vengeance. What are other kind of examples you guys see a lot? Or you think are interesting?
Well, you and I just did Full Metal Alchemist / Brotherhood. And the character of Scar, who was the survivor of a massacre / genocide, coming to the nation that instituted that tragedy and taking vengeance upon people, soldiers from that nation for that, I think was one of the most interesting parts of that show. And he was a very fascinating character.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, the Punisher is the big one for me. I feel like if you scratch any superhero, you can find a story about vengeance, and it works for some of them better than others. And I have a lot of thoughts about vengeance as a structural tool and how, like, the difficulties that it causes. But the other thing that immediately came to mind was, I don't know if either of you ever watched the TV show Revenge with Emily Van Camp from like 15 years ago.
No.
It was great. My friends and I used to call it a revenge procedural. It's like very, very loosely based on the Count of Monte Cristo, but not really. And it's Emily Van Camp plays. It's like, what if the Count of Monte Cristo was set in the Hamptons? And Emily Van Camp plays this woman who, like, as a child, her father was framed for funding terrorists by these rich Hamptons people. And so she's come back to the Hamptons under a false name to destroy their lives systematically. And it was so over the top ridiculous and so much fun.
Yeah. Well, and that point you just made, I think actually ties into something you were saying a little bit ago, Riki, about anime. And something I think we're going to talk about a lot is that I think, for me at least, my feeling about how I view vengeance, particularly from a hero type, has a lot to do with how seriously I'm being asked to take it. And that sometimes I feel like the more ridiculous it is, the more over the top it is. I've often talked about the movie Desperado, which I absolutely love. which is 100% a brutal murder spree for vengeance, but it's played so much for humor. You know, a guy gets shot and sorry, a criminal baddie gets killed because they shoot the ceiling fan that's above him and it hits him, and you see this shot of the fan continuing to go because the motor hasn't stopped, hitting this dead guy in the face. I say that it sounds horrific. If you want, you could shoot that as a horrific scene, but in Desperado, it's done purely for comedy. And there are times where I'm like, why in the world am I laughing at this? Oh wait, but there's Antonio Banderas in black leather. I'm not thinking anymore. That's the whole point of that movie.
I mean, Kill Bill, it's not a comedy, but it also steers very hard into being as over the top as possible. So you stop taking the violence seriously.
Right. Well, and so, let's talk about, let me start again. I think those are all great examples. I think one other one that I see a lot particularly in Batman, but I think I've also seen this with Arrow a bunch and others, is when you have a character who is a vigilante, their claim is that they're doing for justice, it does seem like a lot of times the writers will introduce another character who is more on the vengeance side as kind of a foil to our hero. And Batman Mask of the Phantasm is one of my favorite examples of this. But I think you also see it in Birds of Prey with the Huntress character kind of shifting from a vengeance and then having her kind of redemption as she moves more into a justice mindset. Talk about that in terms of how you guys feel about this kind of examples of where vengeance is used as our hero could fall into that. So we're going to show them an example of someone who does that to keep them away from it.
Well, this kind of encapsulates what I've been thinking about on this topic, which is the question of when does vengeance end? Because you all mentioned the Punisher. I believe his family was killed by some crime boss. And so, like in the Punisher movie, we see him go after the crime boss, gain vengeance by killing him and his minions, and then the movie ends.
Right.
But like for comic books, the story keeps going. He keeps doing stuff, no longer against the people who personally harmed him and his family. So is his vengeance over? And what is he doing after that, right? Like that's kind of my question about vengeance and justice. Because after that, I think we can argue that Frank Castle is pursuing justice in a kind of broad way to prevent other similar tragedies from happening, I guess, like a preventative justice or vengeance on behalf of other people who have been wronged, perhaps. But is that still vengeance at that point?
And I think the Punisher is a really interesting character to bring up in that context of like, is he a cautionary tale for other heroes? Because the answer to that depends entirely on whose name is on the cover of the comic book.
Yeah.
So if he's showing up in a Spider-Man or Daredevil comic, then he's absolutely in the wrong and he's a cautionary tale and they can't cross that line. There's literally a Daredevil story where Daredevil goes to jail and the Punisher gets himself arrested and sent to jail so he can be like, don't be like me. It's very funny. But if it's a Punisher story, then all of a sudden Matt Murdock or Peter Parker is ridiculous and naive and they're completely wrong about everything and the Punisher's going to kick their ass. So it really is very much about framing.
Well, and it's funny that you say whose name is on the comic book, because what I felt you were going to say was whose name is on the Netflix MCU show. Because I think perhaps my favorite scene in all of the Netflix MCU, and if not my favorite, definitely in the top 5, is the Punisher in the Daredevil TV show, where he's pushing Daredevil on, you arrest people and then they go to jail and they get out. When I kill them and they never get back up. I'm butchering the line, but it's something like that. And it's this wonderful moment.
You're a half measure, Red.
Yeah, exactly. And where we, and he's, God, why can't I remember the name of the actor who plays Frank Castle?
Jon Bernthal.
Phenomenal at that. And I disagree with him, but he's so close to convincing me, and I get that he's so close to convincing Matt. And then we had the Punisher TV show, which I liked, but frankly, by the end, I couldn't believe him as a hero anymore because I thought he was too far into vengeance. And we had some great discussions about that. And I think you're right. Yeah, it's that when he's there for Daredevil, he's the foil for Daredevil. But when he has his own show, and this is kind of a related question I wanted to talk about, which is like, is vengeance something that should be for heroes, for anti-heroes, for villains, or all three? Because for me, at least with the Punisher, it works for him as an anti-hero or as a foil. When they tried to make him the hero, for me at least, that show which went too far. I couldn't buy it.
Well, also, and I want to go back with this to something that Riki said before about when does vengeance stop, and what I was saying before about the structural issues with vengeance, which is again like, when does it stop and who are you avenging? And so in the comics, Frank's mission is very much framed as eradicating all organized crime, or sometimes just eradicating crime, because he's not after the guy who pulled the trigger that killed his family. He's after the system that killed his family, which I think was a smart choice because it allows you to keep telling Punisher stories indefinitely. Whereas, and one of the problems with the TV shows was that they were like, you know, in season 2 of Daredevil, he's after the guys who were behind his family's death, and then he gets them. And then in the season 1 of The Punisher, he finds out there was a whole different thing behind that. And so he gets those guys. And then in season 2, it's like, oh no, there was a whole, it's like, how deep does the rabbit hole go? Like, how many people were in Central Park that day trying to kill Frank Castle for this like Russian nesting doll of reasons?
Yeah.
And so when you're doing these ongoing stories, when it's comics, if it's a TV show, I mean, if we have a superhero movie, you know, the Marvel Studios is going to bleed that dry. You're going to get 5 more movies. You have to figure out a way, if you want a character to be motivated by vengeance, that you can't have it be against one guy or one group of guys, because then either they get them and the story's over, or they don't get them and you're like, why does this guy suck at vengeance?
Right. Well, it's interesting that you say that that's what you meant by where does vengeance end? Because I completely agree with you. But Riki, I actually thought you were going to go in a different direction, which is that a lot of times also when we scratch the surface, we find out, you know, this person wants to kill Frank Castle, or you know, Frank Castle kills those people, and then the 10-year-old son of that guy grows up and wants to come back and kill Frank, and then that person's, you know, where it's just the going back and forth and back and forth. And I love that we're getting more and more motivations for villains, and often it's vengeance now that is the motivation for a villain. And a lot of times it's kind of justified, you know, not where we might say like, okay, I don't want you going this far with your vengeance, but I get why you're that pissed at Tony Stark. I get why you're that pissed at, you know, Bruce Wayne or whoever it is. And I think that's another kind of interesting question is about the ethics of vengeance in general. Is it never stops? You know, how does it just become a cycle of every time someone from the side that just got vengeance upon them now wants vengeance upon that person, and on and on and on.
No, I mean, it doesn't stop. And that's what made the story in Full Metal Alchemist with Scar so powerful, is that Winry chose not to take vengeance upon him for literally killing her parents. And then that opened his eyes and made him choose a different path himself. So yeah, absolutely. I was also reminded with the whole like who's responsible for Frank Castle's family dying thing of Drax the Destroyer in Guardians of the Galaxy, where they're like, well, now you've avenged your family because we killed Ronan the Accuser. He's like, well, but Ronan was working for Thanos, so we still got to go after Thanos.
Right. Yeah. Well, and the flip side of that, and this is actually the only one I can think of the character got vengeance. Now what do they do? Moving outside of the realm, although I think it's fairly comic booky, Inigo Montoya. Inigo Montoya wants vengeance on the Six-Fingered Man because he killed his father. Very clear vengeance story. And in this, by the way, again, I think because it's fantasy, we're okay with it. Inigo Montoya is straight up a hero. He's not an anti-hero at all. He's an antagonist who becomes a protagonist, but he's straight up a heroic character. There's never a moment of moral doubt about the goodness of his quest. And then he kills the Six-Fingered Man, and he literally goes, I don't know what to do with myself now. This has been my quest for 20 years. What comes next? Well, have you thought of piracy? Which I'm thinking of it, I can't think of anyone else in fiction of the kinds we're talking about, at least, who gets that vengeance and then has that honest moment of what do I do now? Well,
and he does, but he also, I don't think it's not framed as like oh, I've wasted my life. He's like, well, that's done. Maybe I'll
Yeah.
take up gardening. Like he's super happy about it. He's very satisfied. And the
Right.
audience is satisfied.
Right. Well, and let's talk about that, because at least I was saying that I am a little bit troubled by the Punisher in the TV show when it becomes, he's so focused on vengeance and a lot of other problems, like I think the collateral damage that he tolerates and stuff like that. But Inigo Montoya, I'm totally rooting for. Like, I'm totally rooting for. I think I'm fair to saying I don't want a world of vigilantes, each killing the people they think have wronged them. But when Inigo Montoya does it, when Antonio Banderas in Desperado, I think the only character name he ever gets is El Mariachi. When Poison Ivy is killing off corporate CEOs. Like, I think there's another great example I've been thinking about a lot. In the very first episode of the new Harley Quinn show, here's one that's probably actually the most equivalent to the events that happened last year. Poison Ivy has found these CEOs of companies that are polluting the environment, killing off vegetation that she obviously loves so much, and she's brutally murdering them. And Harley finds it and is like, cool, you go, girl. And we, the audience, are 100% feeling like, yeah, you go, girl. Why is it you think that sometimes vengeance can be troubling and sometimes it can be like, yeah, we're totally rooting for it?
Well, to me, that's on the storyteller, like how the story is told, like what the world building that they do, and then the way that they are framing the villain or whoever is gaining the vengeance, and the victims that they are killing or hurting, right? Like, you can tell these stories in a way where your sympathies lie in one direction. Like the Inigo Montoya one, we don't know anything about the six-fingered man. I can't even remember his name, right? Like, so
Count Rugen.
What was it?
Count Rugen.
Oh, well, there you go.
My father read that story to me every night when I was a kid. So that's the only reason I know it.
But at least in the movie, he's not really a character, right? Like, he is the subject of Inigo Montoya's vengeance. And that's really the only context we see him in.
We do know one other thing about him, which is that he likes to torture people. Like, he tortures Wesley, and that's the only other piece of information which continues to make us feel a certain way about him. Yeah.
And in this story, like, he is very much framed as a bad guy. And I'm not saying that there are good aspects to him. We don't know anything. We don't know anything. We're not told anything about him. So I think it's very easy to be like, yeah, that guy should die, especially when Inigo has been repeating the line over and over. And we get behind that. We're like, yeah, okay. Like, I think the repetition of that line is in fact meant to get you into that mindset of like, if it were me, yeah, I wouldn't want to kill the guy who killed my father, right? Like, that's the whole point of all that.
Right. Because it's very dehumanizing. And I think that's why part of what I love so much about the Netflix MCU and other kind of media like that is really trying to be so realistic is that there's nobody who's a cardboard cutout. Every character we find, for the most part, they at least try, has their own motivation. You see why they're the hero of their own story. Like, I kind of feel like if we had the Netflix MCU version of The Princess Bride, which, please God, don't anyone make, but we'd find out that Inigo's father was actually this like exorbitantly priced, like had made a deal with Count Rugen and then tripled the price, and or like he had done something terrible to Count Rugen's family, or Count Rugen, because he was a six-fingered man, was so treated terribly in the world because of his physical deformity, whatever it was. Like, we'd have that kind of a backstory. But you're right, and it's a lot easier to hate someone and to just enjoy the idea of their vengeance when they're not a character, when they're just that person. They're just the corporate CEO that Poison Ivy is going after, or the six-fingered man, or the Don of the mafia family that killed your parents, or whatever it is.
Well, and I think it also has to do with a couple of things that we've touched on. And one of those things is tone. Like, The Princess Bride is a comedy.
Yeah.
Harley Quinn is a comedy. Like,
Desperado comedy.
Right. And like, I think that The Punisher often works best. Like, obviously the TV show is not a comedy. The movies are not comedies. Even the comics are not, but they are often so ridiculous. Like, they are so completely over the top that you get swept up in it. It's like I was saying about the show Revenge before. Like, it's so zany, it's so ridiculous that you're just along for the ride. And the other thing is collateral damage. And I mean, Inigo Montoya is not killing other people. He's killing the one guy that he's after. He's not like slaughtering his way through armies to get to the six-fingered man.
He kills a lot of the six-fingered man's personal guards, but yes, I agree with you.
You're right, he does. I mean, like,
he's not killing innocent civilians by any means.
No. And, you know, he does kidnap Buttercup, but they're friends after that, so it's fine. I don't know how it's handled on Harley Quinn, but it sounds like she's targeting the CEOs very specifically. And it made me think of the first season of Arrow when they were trying really hard to like do some kind of Occupy Wall Street thing, but they weren't very good at it. And it was like way too complex of a topic for them to handle. And so every episode, you just had Oliver killing a bunch of hired bodyguards and getting to the CEO and being like, be less greedy. Okay, bye, and leaving. And like,
you have failed this city.
Right, like doing absolutely nothing about the people causing harm. But I remember once keeping track, and I think he murdered 47 people in season 1, if you don't count explosions where you can't count how many people it is. But like none of them was the actual person doing something bad.
Yeah.
Well, that's because Oliver Queen himself is rich. So like those are his buddies.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I think doesn't the Huntress, that actual character, show up in like season 2 or season 3 of Arrow?
Everyone shows up.
She does.
Well,
and they use it that way to have her as a character where it's like, don't cross the line, Oliver. And it's like, what line? He can't even see the line anymore.
Well, and I think that's sometimes the point, is that you'll sometimes have like someone is not, our character is bad, but this person is clearly worse. And so that like it kind of makes our person better by association. And I'll say it's one thing that I really liked about as a contrast to that Black Panther, because in that I think there is a good deal of vengeance behind the feeling of Killmonger, but also there's clearly an idea of his base critique that Black Panther is wrong, that Wakanda needs to be more involved in the world, is correct. And by the end of the movie, you know, T'Challa is doing exactly that.
But then what do you do with, like, you know, we have so many villains now who are from some sort of marginalized identity and or tragic backstory, and they're attacking like someone who is powerful and privileged, and then the superhero steps in and is like, no, you can't kill Lex Luthor, that's wrong. And it's like, but Lex Luthor ate my family. Well, if you do this, you're just as bad as him. Like, right. I struggle with that, because I feel like it's a way to dismiss the valid points that the villain is making. And it's all in the framing of the story. Like you take those valid points and you put them into the mouth of a character that you can then disregard because they are a vengeful vigilante and we don't have to listen to them.
Right. Yeah. Go ahead.
I actually think there's a really pertinent example at the end of Falcon and the Winter Soldier, or Captain America and the Winter Soldier, right? Where the Flag Smashers are seeking vengeance against the rich people and the politicians for the things that are wrong in the world. And Captain America Sam stops them, but then he makes that speech and he turns to, I believe, a senator, and he says, Senator, you need to do better for these people. I think that, to me, like in this discussion, is the follow-up, is like, yes, I 100% believe that murder is wrong, like even in the pursuit of vengeance against someone who has wronged you or a lot of people. But those with power have to do better to stop the bad things from happening in the first place or in the future.
I mean, I get your point, but to me, Falcon and the Winter Soldier is like it fails at doing that, because the face of the Flag Smashers is a young woman of color who's lost everything. And it's like, well, ultimately she was irredeemable. And the other antagonist is a white guy who just like gets too full of himself and then causes a lot of problems. And they're like, well, he can be redeemed. He can become better, which like really did not sit well with me. And then to turn around and like give that lip service to the person in power and be like, but you know, they had a point. To me, it undercuts the point that was made, because you can have the hero make a speech, but the actual actions of the plot are about stopping this person because they're wrong. And it's sort of like making a speech about justice after it's closing the barn door after all the animals are out. Like they've already shown visually that person is not righteous.
Yeah, Falcon and Winter Soldier is probably my most disappointing of the MCU shows on Disney, and for exactly the reason. And I think, Ricky, I very much hear what you're saying, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. But I also think it kind of proves what Jessica, what you were saying there about like how it's a way of undercutting the villains, because for me, the way they set that up, the villains were really trying to do we're doing these acts so that people understand how much anger there is, that people understand how broken things are. And when it became vengeance, I just didn't believe it. Like, I was watching it going, this is horrible PR, which until now the people have been very good about PR. This is absolutely going to backfire. And all of a sudden, this character has this motivation of vengeance that they have not shown in the past. And I know that was a show that got very affected by the pandemic, and they did a lot of rewrites. And I think that the original version, it probably would have really threaded the needle a lot better. But yeah, I think that's a great example where it feels like the fact that sometimes that if a person has a very legitimate point about how angry they are, the fact that anger can turn to vengeance is then used to delegitimize the anger, which to me is really frustrating, because I do want to see kind of more what you're saying, Ricky, of Winter Soldier's speech there, Falcon's speech there, not Winter Soldier's, Captain America's speech there, is him saying like, we may disagree with what they did about the anger, but we have to pay attention to the anger and realize our fault in causing so much harm that's leading people to be so angry.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all the points you made about the character itself, herself, Carly, right? Morgenthau and the Flag Smashers, like being kind of a jumbled mess in terms of motivation and basically like taking the actions they did to serve the plot, which is never great, versus kind of being true to your own character and doing things that make sense logically for that character. Yeah, absolutely. I think it could have been much better. And the whole thing about U.S. Agent too, right? The failed Captain America being exonerated, like getting, I guess, joining the Thunderbolts now. It did not sit right, especially given what else that show was trying to tell us about race and all that. But maybe it was being true to the real world in that sense, that this guy like basically failed up and did like the most despicable thing possible in that situation, and yet he's being given yet another chance.
Yeah,
a white guy.
We'll see what happens with that character. I'm actually probably the most curious to see what they do with him in the movie.
Yeah, I have such mixed feelings about the Thunderbolt movie, because there's some of the characters that I really love so much, and then some I just have no interest in.
Where's Baron Zemo?
Right? Honestly, I just watch him dance for 2 more hours, but that's a whole other story. So let's talk about another aspect of this that kind of ties into a question about why do we sometimes enjoy it, and but also is about kind of like when it's right or when it's wrong in terms of how we see it. Revenge fantasy. And Jessica, I wonder if you would talk a bit about, like, we have a lot more attention being paid recently to movies that are often being referred to as like the coming of rage story, that we're seeing a lot more like women's vengeance, women's violence being portrayed as like a heroic in I think really important ways. I'm curious about your thoughts on that trend and how that kind of plays into all this.
Yeah, I mean, women are angry. Like, not to speak for all women, but I think I speak for all women when I say women are angry. And it is not always easy to get those stories through, given, especially like film and television, given how many layers there are to get through and gatekeepers. But it is a narrative that we see audiences responding to, especially female audiences. And I think, the last time I was on here, we were talking about Superman, and Superman as a power fantasy, but specifically the fantasy of like, what if you could protect people? What if you could keep people safe? What if you could make the world better? Not a fantasy of like violence or harming others.
Right.
And this is the flip side of that. That like, there's also an equally valid power fantasy of like, what if I could go after everyone that hurt me and go after everyone who hurt people like me and kick their ass. Like we've talked about Kill Bill, we've talked about the Birds of Prey movie, also Harley Quinn's plotline in the second Suicide Squad movie. These are really satisfying things to watch. They're cathartic in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I don't remember if it was you who said this when we talked about Birds of Prey or someone I read, but I remember someone talking about that, like the power of the Harley Quinn storyline in Birds of Prey is anyone who's had a shitty ex, anyone who's been broken up with in a terrible way. And it just, you have the fantasy of like, going like the person from TLC, I think it was Left Eye, burning down David Justice's house, or, what Harley Quinn does of just like, yeah. And that cathartic point to me is so interesting, because I think often these kind of revenge fantasies, we think of like the term guilty pleasure comes to mind, but I think it's important that we go beyond that, that there is something useful and helpful about, not that like, I don't think millions of people went out and watched Harley Quinn and then went out and burned down their ex's homes or, did terrible things, but the chance to imagine that, wouldn't it be satisfactory to see that horrible thing happen, or to me to do the horrible thing to this person who in my mind has wronged me with a capital W, that can tick a box in a way that people can be psychologically healthy for people. Can be.
Well, I also think it's important, like talking specifically about like women's revenge movies. Like there's a French movie that's literally called Revenge, about a woman who goes after men who have sexually assaulted her. It's a very heavy movie, but it's the violence in it like serves this purpose of reflecting back the violence that was done to her, right? Like, and I think it's important, for me, like as a man, like to think about that and what the world is like for women specifically, right, like in these situations, and obviously like to not do that and perpetrate that, but also to think about the way that when we talk about issues like this, that we often excuse things, maybe not literally, but there are ways that discussions about these topics happen that minimize the damage, or sometimes exonerate men, or all the stuff that happened around what was it, the Depp Heard trial, right? And the discussions on that. It was men excusing other men's actions, whether it was literally saying like, well, he didn't do it, or just like, oh, that's just, we've heard terms like locker room talk, like all of that kind of stuff is wrong. And these movies, or these fantasies, these revenge fantasies, should not only highlight, how vengeance is taken, but what they're taken for and what we need to do to correct it. Like I still like come back to that of, we need to be better, right? Like Captain America said, Senator, you need to be better. But these are cases where all of us need to be better in a sense, like,
Yeah.
because we all have power over very personal situations like this.
Well, there's two things that come to mind here, and I'll say the first, and then get into the second. Let you guys talk about it, and then get in the second. But the first one being, I feel like a lot of times, vengeance movies really hit us and fulfill that revenge fantasy when we see people getting away with doing bad things, and
Yeah.
that the system that we would want that would have a fairly reasonable consequence isn't happening. And so the fantasy of the completely unreasonable, or not even unreasonable, but completely like, far over the top happening is incredibly part of why we want that is because nothing else is happening. We want someone to shoot the bad guy because the justice system has failed and they've gone free. We want someone to, finally figure out that the white guy is not actually being very successful and do something about that because they do keep failing upward. How much do you think that is part of the revenge fantasy as well? Is that it's someone has to do something because the normal systems aren't working.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I think like in the case of like a big picture thing like that,
Mhm.
like a CEO or a politician, right? Like those are people we think of as having a lot of power. And when there's a revenge story against them, it's because like we are so powerless
Yeah.
in our regular lives to really do anything against them. So it's like, oh, well, like someone actually did something, and that can resonate due to our powerlessness.
Yeah. And I want to bring that back to a gendered framing
Mhm.
for a minute, because when you talk about these vengeance stories, like we were just talking about stories where a female character is getting vengeance, but that's not the role women usually play in vengeance stories. The role they usually play is the object that's being avenged. I mean,
Right.
look at the Punisher. His family, including his wife and daughter, are killed. Look at Drax. His family is killed. Like the over and over again. I mean, that's where the term phrygian comes from. When you talk about phrygian, it's not just a woman dying. It's a woman dying or being sexually assaulted or beaten or kidnapped or whatever in order to further a male story. And so there's something particularly cathartic about sort of coming out of the fridge and going
Taking
after
your
the
own
bastard
vengeance.
yourself. Exactly.
Well, there was and that kind of ties into the other thing I was going to raise, that this is what brought up for me. The term punching up is often used in humor, that like people making fun of their oppressors feels a lot better than making fun of the oppressed people. And I wonder, can we use the same framework for vengeance movies? Because like, there are men who have been wronged and cheated on or treated terribly by women in relationships. It can happen in any kind of gender combination. But as I'm thinking about it, like, and I would say that's happened to me once or twice. I've also been a terrible partner at times. But like the idea of a movie about a man who's had his heart broken by a woman and thus goes on a revenge fantasy quest sounds horrific to me. In the same way of like, but yet I'm sure that's a power fantasy that unfortunately is very popular among some folks.
I mean, they exist, but they're weirdly romantic comedies, right?
Yeah.
That's the problem. Is that these men go on like do terrible things in this quote unquote comedic context because they were wronged by a woman. They're because their feelings were hurt by a woman, right? Like, so they don't fit into this vengeance thing we're talking about.
Right. And like with humor, like there isn't the systemic system of sexism that's playing into it. And like another good example I think of this is the movie Shaft, which many of you have seen the documentary about the movie Shaft. They make a really big deal about how it was turned into the beginning of this blaxploitation genre, which is there's a whole lot of complicated stuff about that I'm not even going to get into. But like the director very much wanted a movie where the black guy gets to get away with all the things that the white guys normally get to do. That he sleeps with a white woman, he kills a cop, he's a drug dealer, he's a heroic guy, and he gets away with it because that had never been seen. And is this a fair framework to think about then, of like the kind of, we feel a lot better about vengeance movies when it's a punching up?
I mean, to bring back Arrow, like Oliver Queen is a member of the 1%, so seeing him scolding other members of the 1% is not that satisfying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fair. And
Yeah, I don't even know if it would be a vengeance plot if some powerful person. I mean, like Bruce Wayne. Okay, are we gonna talk about Batman and
yeah,
what the
He
heck
is
he's doing?
vengeance and he is the knight, so
yeah,
But he's not.
he's
Okay,
not.
right? Like that line is very famous from Batman the Animated Series, and they riffed on it again in the Pattinson Batman of
mhm.
calling himself Vengeance. But I feel like in comics, he has not been Vengeance,
No.
really, ever. So it's kind of weird that like the modern version of Batman has become this.
Well, and that goes back to sort of the structural thing of like, who would he be avenging? Because if he's going after the guy who killed his parents, that's just like a mugger. So,
Yeah.
like, I mean, we know who he is. His name's Joe Chill. They've done a
Yeah.
million comics with him, and they all suck because who cares?
But
Like,
they've also
not
created weird
interesting.
storylines where Joe Chill was hired by
I
like
know
I hate
Falcone or
that. I hate
somebody
that.
or
It's the worst. It's the
but it's
worst.
the thing
Like,
we were talking about earlier. Like you gain vengeance on the person who personally wronged you, and then
Right.
what? You're like, well, like they're part of an organization.
Well,
and then I think it also goes back to like, it's a way to make Batman the underdog. Like Bruce Wayne
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
an insanely wealthy white man. Like he has almost every access of privilege available to him, but what he's fighting is the notion of crime itself, and that allows him
Mhm.
to be punching up in a way that any individual villain, like when he fights the Joker, I mean, I'm on record as not being a Joker fan, but also that guy can't throw a punch. Look at him. Like,
Yeah.
come on. But when he's fighting against like the evil and depravity within the human spirit, then it's like, oh, you can do it, little buddy. Like that's when we
Yeah.
want to root for him because that is something that he can punch up against.
I think some of my favorite Batman stories are the ones that, and I think this is kind of the year one idea often, where he does start out very motivated by vengeance, but then gets to a point where he realizes, like, this isn't going to serve me at all.
Yeah.
Often because he does the vengeance or someone else does, someone kills Joe Chill, or he realizes Joe Chill just, was just looking to score for that night to get money to get his next fix or to get a meal or whatever it is. And now we say that, maybe what should have happened is Bruce Wayne should realize that like the best way to fix Joe Chill is to give him a job instead of beating him up. But that's another story. But I think I really love those stories where he starts out wanting that and then has that flip of realizing, no, I shouldn't be about trying to punish. I should be about trying to protect. And you're right. It's not about one particular crime family. It's about how do I fix the corruption? How do I fix the police department? How do I give people hope again? Which is what I think is so revolutionary about the end of
Yes.
the Robert Pattinson movie. And also, I love the Penguin TV show. I want to talk about it, but it kind of ignores the most important parts of the Batman movie in ways that make me frustrated. But it's a whole other story. But yeah, and it to pull it back into the real world, one of the political causes that I've been most involved with is anti-death penalty work, especially when I was in California, a state that has the death penalty, and carried out the death penalty a number of times while I was a citizen there. And that was something I was very, very opposed to and did a lot of protesting work. And one person I saw at a number of protests was the father of, I think it was a daughter, I'm not sure, but someone who'd been killed. And he had been, as the father of the murder victim, campaigning for the murderer to get the death penalty. And the person, it happened, they were caught, they were given the death penalty, they were killed, he was there. And he now speaks at anti-death penalty rallies because he talked about how he kept telling himself that he would feel better once he saw the murderer of his child killed. But then he said these haunting words I'll never forget. I woke up and my son was still dead. I'm saying son, I think it was son, but whatever it was. But I woke up and my child was still dead. And that hit me really hard. And I think is the kind of flip side of a lot of these things of that's kind of also the difference between the personal vengeance story and this kind of like striking a blow for the oppressed group, or the abused group, is that it's not about, I want to kill this person to deal with my grief. It's about, I want to kill this person or do this thing or bring this person down so that this doesn't happen to somebody again.
But then I think that that's no longer vengeance.
Mm-hmm.
If you're
Right.
doing it to make a better world, that's
Justice.
yeah.
Right. Right. Well, and I think that's where one of the things that I think is most interesting when these stories explore it, because I think it happens all the time, is self-deception. And I think that in the same way everyone thinks that they're the hero, I do think almost everyone who's out for vengeance can convince themselves that they're doing it for justice. And sometimes there's a question of like, who are we to sit and judge them? But the whole point of this podcast is that we sit and judge them. I think that's an interesting it's an interesting exercise in when do we think they're right? When do we think they're wrong? And with someone like Batman, I think for the most part, I think he's right. But I think a lot of times he does stumble and get it wrong. And this pains me to say, Jessica, but there are times in the Justice League cartoon, for example, where I think Superman is the one who has to pull him back some. And
Yes.
does a good job.
I have had to sit on so many episodes to get to this point.
you know.
Well, and I also think there's different, for lack of a better word, there's different ways of somebody being quote unquote right. There's like what we would want to happen in reality, and there's
Right.
what we would want to happen in an abstract, like moral exercise, and there's what is satisfying emotionally, and those are not always the same thing. And it's like, I mean, you started this episode saying that, you know, none of us are here going, woohoo, murder is the solution to everything.
Yeah.
But certainly in fiction, there are times that you're not even going, well, you know, of course I would disapprove of this in real life. You're like, yeah, get him, Frank. Like it's fun and it's satisfying and it feels right. I mean, Inigo Montoya killing the six-fingered man feels right. Is it? That's a different question.
Yeah.
I mean, what's shocking to me is the number of Disney movies that end with a villain dying. Like, I was watching, what is it, Beauty and the Beast, and Gaston. I was like, oh, he just fell from the top of this tower. He's dead, right? Like, probably.
Oh, yeah.
But I think that's the key, is that an awful lot of them, and I read something about this, that this was a very intentional policy for a while. The hero never kills the villain.
Right.
The villain kills themselves. Like, and the best example that's used is that the dragon in Sleeping Beauty, which I think is Maleficent. I don't remember, I may be mixing up my but she charges at the Prince Philip, I think, and he dodges and she falls off the edge of a cliff and dies.
And also the sword like magically flies into her heart, but it's a magic sword. That's right. But there's a lot of Gaston falls to it, like, and I think there's even a moment where the Beast is trying to save him, and he
Gaston stabs the Beast, which causes him to lose his grip.
Fall.
Yep.
So it's his own fault. But my point was, like,
Snow White, act of God. She's on a cliff that gets hit by lightning. She falls. Like,
yeah.
Snow White didn't do it. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, my point was that the death, like, of a villain is so satisfying to audiences that it happens even in Disney movies that we think of as like these clean, happy things. It's like, oh, like, yeah, like this is just part of our cultural thing, is that that guy's so bad we want him to die. And
I mean, in The Little Mermaid, Ursula gets skewered with a boat. I couldn't watch that scene until I was like 12. It messed me up so bad.
It's a lot.
It's a lot.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because I've come to realize that I no longer find those satisfying, but it's not for some like morality reason. It's that what I want the villain to realize they were wrong. You know, that the person they thought would never come back to get them has come back to get them, or that the police would never actually rise against them, or whatever it is. You know, like, whatever that the people they think they've bought don't stay bought. And so I'm always frustrated when they just die instead of having that moment of realization of like, oh no, I was wrong. But yeah, it's the same kind of thing. Well, we've been talking for a while here, and I want to kind of just, I think we've already been kind of touching on this a lot, but maybe kind of get into the, this is our wrap-up question. So how do you see, like, where are the difference? What are the things that create differences between like what we might say, like, yeah, I'm actually like in a real world, I totally want this to happen, versus what we enjoy on screen?
I mean, there's
I,
a lot of things that I enjoy in media that I don't want. Like, I also don't want kid sidekicks to exist in reality. Like, go to school. This is too
Yeah.
dangerous.
Yeah, but watching it when you're 12, watching you, Riki, you and I have talked about this. That when you're 12, like watching a 12-year-old step into a mecha is awesome. Later, you're like, no, kids shouldn't be piloting death robots. That's a bad idea.
no, it is awesome. It's what I've always wanted to do.
Yeah.
But at least when we're talking about Gundam, like it shows you why we shouldn't do that.
Right.
Because every one of those kids, at least like in the first half of Gundam's history, like they end up severely traumatized by war.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, like I prefer my vengeance. I prefer it when they are either a villain or, as we said, an anti-hero, a foil, like not the primary protagonist. And then I think I prefer vengeance to be less bloody, I guess. I don't know how to put this, but scenes where someone just like beats the person of their ire to a bloody pulp like make me deeply uncomfortable in a way, and I would prefer just like a laser blast or just an explosion to take them out. So like I guess the personalness of vengeance, like when someone takes their vengeance and just like gets in the face of the person that they're upset with, and just like we see like too much of that, it makes me uncomfortable, and I frankly like I don't like to see that.
Probably one of, if not my top 3 favorite superhero movies is Logan, and part of it's because I think one of the most upsetting scenes I've ever seen, and it's so chilling, is when these superpowered little kids get a chance to enact vengeance on the person who's done terrible things to them, and it's shot like a horror movie. This like group of kids coming around and exactly you're talking about, brutally killing a person who I have no sympathy and no love for. And like in almost any other circumstance, I'd be like, oh my God, yes, you go, kids. But instead, I'm like, oh my God, these kids are now trapped in the same cycle of brutality. It's a heartbreaking scene while also feeling like justified vengeance. And it's one of the most harrowing scenes. And the fact that I'm so conflicted about it is part of why I think it's so good.
Yeah, and that is good storytelling. I say it makes me uncomfortable. I don't want to see it, but when I do see it, like you can and should acknowledge like that it makes you feel a certain way, and that is often the intention.
Yeah, I think it's about like committing to either going in that direction where you're like you're exposing like how this is not a real solution, how it's just repeating the cycle of violence and vengeance, and you know how traumatic it is, etc. Or you go completely goofy over the top. It's when you try to thread the needle in between that you end up with something that's just sort of incoherent, like Falcon and the Winter Soldier, like Arrow, where it's like you haven't thought through what you're trying to say. And I think the ones that are over the top do also think through what they're trying to say. It's that they're very thoughtful approaches. They're just not living in the shades of gray. I think you have to go all shades of gray or all black and white. But if you try to be like, oh, this is messy, but this guy can do no wrong, then that it doesn't make sense and it doesn't work.
There's a scene in the movie Desperado where after brutally killing all these people in hilariously awful, wonderful ways, you know, someone comes up to him and is like, that's awesome that you did this. And our hero says, yes, but everyone I killed was someone's husband, someone's father, someone's son. And you're just like, okay, you filmers, you're trying to have it both ways. You know, you're trying to like put this in here. And it's either like incredibly brilliant or incredibly cynical filmmaking. I'm not quite sure which, but because it does expose that, you know, that like, yes, it's true. And I think maybe that's kind of where my final comment on all this is. And I want to hear from you all as well. It feels like one of the essential parts of vengeance is that we're able to see the person we're getting vengeance on not as a real person, but as a 2D cutout of just the evil ex-boyfriend, the evil CEO, the evil whatever it is. Like you said about Kat Rugen, we don't know anything else about him. And I think kind of when I like for me, I've always said that's kind of like the thing I find most troubling, and that I think I love so much about the whole idea of the dark side in Star Wars is, for me, the essence of the dark side is when your anger at someone allows you to not see any other part of them, to just see them as that 2D cutout. And kind of, I guess that's part of where I see it all in real life, is that I feel like we're in a world more and more where it's easier to see people as 2D cutouts, in part because sometimes, like, and I'm not gonna get into that, it's gonna be too complex. But yeah, so just that to me, that's one of the essentials of all of this, is like it can be helpful to have a person that is a stand-in of that stereotype that it's cathartic to fight against, or to have it be so ridiculously over the top that it's fun to fight against. But that it's that dehumanization that has to go into Vengeance, that when it becomes more real, it becomes a lot harder to watch.
Yes, not to get too I know we don't want to get too into what happened last year.
We can touch on that.
But I do think all of the people who died because their claims were denied were three-dimensional human beings too. Mm-hmm. And that was dehumanization on a massive scale, literally, with AI denying claims. And I'm not saying that what happened was the solution, but I think dehumanizing anybody it's just, I just want to note that dehumanizing anybody ever is not going to end anywhere good.
I appreciate that. And that's what I was trying to say, but also having a lot of trouble putting into words, because to me, it's that there was something I read that said that the killing of the CEO can be seen more than anything as a symptom of a larger problem. And that a part of that is that, and again, this is a much more complicated issue, but the way that the lives of the powerful have become more and more and more separated from the lives of everyone else, I think adds to a lot of this. And that, yeah, I think that the cycle of dehumanization that leads to that certainly does not start with someone thinking of an evil CEO. And I think that's a very important point to keep in mind with all this, and that I think plays into all these discussions.
Yeah, I think rich people are dehumanizing us. Absolutely. Like, that's a thing, that they are so out of touch with reality. Like, I was talking with my wife about the how much could a banana cost? $10, Michael meme, right? From Arrested Development. And that's the thing, like, they are so out of touch with the reality of what an ordinary person deals with. The price of a banana in this meme's case, but like anything, right? Like, that they don't understand what the average or the majority of the people in life go through. And so, like, they make decisions, whether it's healthcare or politics or anything, and it's like they don't touch reality at all.
Right.
Our reality.
I think we're seeing another example of that right now in the, massive move of, we've had our government telling us for months that TikTok is super dangerous because it could give our data to, the Chinese government. And so a lot of people, the response is, okay, cool, I'm going to find the app that directly gives the information to the Chinese government, or the meme of, I'm just going to start printing out my search history and sending it to the Chinese consulate or whatever. I think that what undergirds a lot of these things is and just to tie it even more, like some of the analysis I've read about the movie Jennifer's Body, which I think is often seen as like one of the beginnings of this modern version of the coming of age stories. Fantastic movie that got totally mismarketed and is really a great exploration of this kind of, revenge fantasy. And one thing that the reviewer said is that she thought the most important part of the reaction was men who didn't get it, like who just were like, I don't get it. Why would someone be this angry? And that's the point, is that like the movie is supposed to be about helping you see, like, this is how angry people are. This is how angry women are. This is how angry people are at racism, at sexism, and at what's happening in healthcare, what's happening in international policy, stuff like that. And vengeance isn't what I'm going to choose as a method, but I think for me, one of the essential questions I'm always going to ask when I see an act of vengeance is, was a person given a chance to get the message across that something was wrong in some other way before they chose vengeance. And if not, then I'm not going to condone it, but I can understand it.
Well, I've got kind of a broad shift, if I may.
Please.
Like I took some notes and I did some research on the character of the Spectre, who's a DC Comics character, and then Ghost Rider, right, who's from Marvel. And I was most interested. They're both supernatural agents of vengeance. They inhabit like human bodies or to interact with the world, but the Spectre is an agent of quote unquote God, is my understanding, and I don't know how deep that goes and like how connected it is to a specific God. They just say God.
Oh, it's the Christian God. He's
okay.
I don't know that they specify, but basically, yeah, he's the embodiment. Like his like tagline or whatever is the embodiment of God's vengeance, specifically.
And then Ghost Rider originally was given his powers by Satan, but I think it's been retconned to be Mephisto, which is just Marvel Satan. Like, let's be honest. But that to me, like we've talked a lot about human vengeance, but this is like supernatural vengeance, and so I find it interesting because it seems to me like that gives it more license to be correct. Like, how does that sound to you in terms of vengeance?
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with Ghost Rider. I haven't read many Ghost Rider comics, but in what I've seen of the Spectre, it's very much like the Spectre knows what's the right thing to do because he is imbued with divine knowledge and like enacts, like I know there was a run in the 70s that's like infamous for like the horrific consequences that he visited on, like, oh, this logger is cutting down a forest, I'll turn him into a tree, and then he gets fed into a wood chipper, like that kind of, and like is conscious while that's happening. Like those are the kinds of acts of vengeance that he would enact. And I he was less certain of what he was doing when Hal Jordan was the Spectre for a bit, and then there was a lot of like, oh, what's the right thing to do? But yeah, usually it's like, I just know because I'm the Spectre and God told me, and now that guy is gonna melt or whatever.
Yeah, I think for me, it's funny. My favorite comic book hero is still Daredevil, and a part of why I love him so much is that he has so much doubt, and that for me, I'm a very religious person. I'm also a deeply agnostic person, and I kind of think you have to be agnostic to actually be a person of faith. I think if you have certainty, that's no longer faith. That's you're telling yourself a fairy tale. Wow, I probably lost a whole bunch of listeners. But my point being that because I think that there's a line in a Billy Joel song, "Shades of Grey," which is a wonderful, wonderful song, and there's a line in it that the only people I fear are those who never have doubts, and I think that if you believe that God has put you on this earth to right wrongs, kind of going to what you were saying, Jessica, about like what's the authority that you adhere to, you are literally, you've given yourself the ultimate authority and nothing can question you. And that's not always bad. I mean, John Brown freed slaves and led uprisings to murder slaveholders because he believed God told him to. And on the same token, people blow up abortion clinics and murder abortion doctors and see themselves as modern day John Browns because they think God told them to. And that's true in almost every religion of some degree or another. And yeah, I for me, I think characters like that are really interesting. And I don't know the Spectre very much, but I think that I would not want to see a character presented as a hero who is told that God is telling them what to do, and we are supposed to agree with that. I'm a big believer that God should never appear on stage, and that that should always be portrayed as a problem, a self-justification. And that may well be true in the case of the Spectre. I'm not saying it isn't. But like to me, someone like Daredevil or Nightcrawler, for whom their faith is something they're constantly wrestling with and wondering should they be doing what they're doing, is what I want to see, because I think, yeah, we're probably gonna do a whole other episode on it, but to me, one of the other fundamental questions is accountability. And I think if you're someone who's going to say, I have this power, I'm going to try and do right, there has to be, to some degree, that you are accountable to others, whether that's the law, whether that's your community, whether that's, your law clerk and your secretary, whatever it is. There has to be other people who you're going to listen to when they say, I think you're wrong. And the closer you get to God telling you, the harder that is.
But I think the difference between like a character like Daredevil or Nightcrawler, like garden variety Catholics, like it is literally true in the case of the Spectre that God told him to do that. Like that's
yeah, this is why like I mentioned this in the context of supernatural.
Yeah.
In that it's similar to the TV show The Fall of the House of Usher, in that the character in that is some kind of spirit of vengeance. We don't know how or why, like that's not explained in the same way that the Spectre is. But I feel like characters like that give us some moral clarity, and that we trust them, right?
Yeah.
Like I understand what Matthew is saying, that if there was a human character who says that they are acting on behalf of God, like
terrifying.
that is uncomfortable, and that should be questioned. At least in the context of these fictions, like I think we just believe that this is happening because the supernatural thing is allowing for it.
Right.
Yeah, I think the better word for it is maybe karma. Like it's, there's a proud tradition in comic books, which was briefly stifled because of the comics code, but horror comics, which are just like, hey, here's a terrible person. They're doing terrible things. Now an ironic, terrible thing is going to happen to them. And everybody goes away feeling great about it. Because, maybe freaked out, but also yes, that's how it's supposed to work. And the Spectre is the agent through which, in Spectre stories, that consequence is karmically visited on the person who deserves it.
Yeah, I found it interesting because that actually, like the revision of the comics code in 1971 is what is cited as when the Spectre turned to what you're describing, and Ghost Rider was created as a character around the same time.
Off. Yeah.
So it was like the loosening of the comics code, and they're like, well, I think we can have characters that go a little more deeper, I guess, into the violence of it all.
Yeah, and I certainly think, like, kind of a part of the revenge fantasy is the Schadenfreude of it all, and that we want to see that. But I think for me, I would have, and I think this is kind of the same way that, like, because my parents are lawyers, they have real trouble with Law and Order. I just would have real trouble watching that because I have so much theology.
The TV show.
Yeah, like I would have so much trouble watching a TV show about a character who I'm being told I can believe their vengeance because God is telling them to do that. Because I just that idea is so horrifically dangerous, and so rife to question, because it's to me, once you are at all certain of anything about God, then we're into days with high body counts. But I can see
I think a Spectre TV show would be unwatchable anyway, so you're probably safe.
Is there a Spectre type character in the MCU? Like I would love to see Daredevil have a conversation with a person like that,
Well, I think it's, not in the MCU yet, but Ghost Rider to me is the equivalent of the Spectre. And it's weird because he's imbued by Mephisto, who is evil. And, in this context of the Spectre, we think of God as good. Right. But I don't know, like Ghost Rider, I guess, has more of a human element to him that makes him more unpredictable than the Spectre.
Right.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of like a good comparable character in the Marvel universe, and I can't think of anybody who. There have definitely been stories where Matt meets someone. You know what? The closest thing I can think of is the Guardian Devil storyline by Kevin Smith in 1999, where basically Matt is given custody of a baby and is like, this baby is the Antichrist and you need to kill it. And he's like, I guess I better kill this baby. And everybody that acts very erratically for a long time. And long story short, it turns out that it is an elaborate hoax by Mysterio, who has been drugging the entire cast with extremely powerful, extremely specific drugs for days and days to make Matt think that he has like been spoken to by God, but it's all a lie. And this is also the storyline where Karen Page dies. So it like things end very badly. The baby survives. And I think that's an interesting like difference between the sort of very epic, not that the Marvel universe isn't epic, but like the very epic and often very clear-cut good and bad world of the DC universe, and like Daredevil's world, where the closest comparison is actually just some weasel drugging everybody and lying and saying that God spoke to him.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, there's a pastor who I know who's done a lot of stuff on MCU stuff and has talked about how like there's absolutely no such thing as a single like theology that understands the MCU, because it is both like there's references to the monotheistic God of Islam and Judaism and Christianity, and then also like Loki and all the Egyptian gods of Mark Spector. What was the name of it? Moon Knight, you know, like all this, you know, it gets very confusing.
I mean, the best take on it is when the Fantastic Four went to heaven and they met God and he was Jack Kirby. It was great.
I can get that. Well, I was saying if someone wanted to write a comic book about like vengeance, like the Book of Exodus is kind of a good version, you know, like the drowning of all the people in the sea. There's an awful lot of vengeance in that story, and yet also a lot of critique of it. That
Listen, he said, let my people go. Pharaoh didn't let us go.
You know, this is going to get way esoteric here, but this is for me, one of the most powerful moments of understanding, like a change in my understanding of vengeance. And I think a lot of young kids who grow up in Jewish families may go through this. There's a moment in the Seder, which is the celebration of Passover, the celebration of the Exodus story, where as you recount the 10 plagues, you're supposed to dip your finger into a glass of wine and spill out a drop onto your plate for everyone. And I thought that was badass as hell. You know, it was like, yeah, we're putting blood up because red wine looks like blood. We're putting blood on our plate to be a big, like, you know, F you Egyptians, like our God got you. And what I later came to learn, and you know, no one in my family had known this until we kind of looked more into it, because the Haggadah we'd worked with was very much not making this lesson, is that the point is to say that you're reducing the amount of wine and thus the amount of joy you have, because we have to remember that the celebration of our freedom came at the death of others, and that should reduce the amount of our celebration, which I think is a gorgeous, gorgeous lesson, and is a complete rejection of the idea of celebrating vengeance. And yet that's not how the ritual appears to a lot of people. And when I've talked to people about this, like that's a lot of people are like, yeah, of course I knew that. And others are like, oh no, I thought that was a big, like, you know, rah God. You sent the plagues, you sent the boils. That's awesome.
Yeah, no, that's my favorite part of the Seder too. And it is for exactly that reason, because of the meaning behind it. And we cannot have a full cup when it came at the cost of other people suffering.
Right. All right. Well, we've now wandered very far from the topic. So any last thoughts from either of you on this general topic? I think have we completely wrapped up the topic of vengeance? Everything's solved. We can move on to the next thing next month.
I think there's a lot more to say.
Yeah.
Someone's going to come after this episode, and the cycle of podcast vengeance will begin.
Oh my God. You want to talk about vengeance and being wronged? Just hang out on podcast Twitter, and you'll see all sorts of things. I'll make this the last question. For each of you, favorite and least favorite example of vengeance as a character motivator.
Oh gosh.
And Riki hates when I don't let him prepare for questions like this, so I apologize.
I mean, it's less that I hate it, as I don't know where to start.
I'll give mine. I think my least favorite is Punisher. I've talked a lot about the MCU Punisher, because I feel like they really try to frame him as heroic in ways that are, I guess to me, because again, like where I have a problem with vengeance is when it does blind you to the things that I think should be taken into account. When it's you're looking for vengeance, like the person who killed your father because they fundamentally believe that your father had done wrong and they had been lied to and manipulated, and now you want to kill that person. Like that to me is what really happened a lot in the Punisher story. My favorite is and I think because I see the words vendetta and vengeance is pretty much, a vendetta is an attempt to get vengeance, is V for Vendetta, because the biggest thing that I feel about vengeance, and here's another whole other thing that we haven't gotten into, is that vengeance is about destroying. It's not about building. And the fundamental thing I think that V for Vendetta holds true is that, like, if you're acting out of vengeance against one system, if that sense of vengeance is carried into the attempt to build the new system, whether it's a new relationship, a new family, a new country, then everything is still going to be about, getting justice against the people who wronged you. And the character of V fundamentally understands he is motivated by vengeance, and so therefore he shouldn't be part of. He's going to destroy the things he hates, but someone else should protect the things that they should love. So that's my personal favorite.
Ricky, you got one?
Okay. I had to Google best stories of vengeance just to see like what was out there and to kind of have my brain triggered. Looking at this, absolutely, like one of my favorites is Gladiator, Maximus. I thought it was just like a beautiful story. Like he gets his vengeance upon the emperor, but then himself dies. But has also along the way like helped other people, inspired people in a way. I've not seen Gladiator 2. I don't know what happens, whether it's even a follow-up to that story or not. But I love that movie. I love that character, and it's a satisfying act of vengeance that doesn't trigger me in the ways that I talked about of like being too personal and bloody and all that. Like it's bloody, like but it's a nice clean fight. My least favorite, looking at this list, John Wick. Like what the heck? I know like people love dogs and like does the dog die is a thing, but my dude, it's a dog, and I know it was a gift from your wife, but did you really like the
You guys are
speaking
gonna
of
get
over the
tweets
top
for this
vengeance?
one.
Like what the heck, John Wick?
My girlfriend literally got a dog a week ago, so I have to kind of. But it's funny. I was going to mention John Wick earlier because I've often heard people bring it up as it. Yes, there's a connection to his wife, but it's not his wife who gets killed, and that it's not that they kind of take romance off the table entirely. And yes, it is connected to her, but that it's not yet again a pretty woman who's brought on screen just to be fridged and be a character motivator.
What's the line from Brooklyn Nine-Nine where Rosa gets the puppy and she's like, I've only had this puppy for a day and a half, and if anything ever happened to him, I'd kill everyone in this room and then myself.
I think that's exactly the line. Like, very popular meme. Jessica, you very very slyly deflected onto Riki, so you can think about it for another minute or two. Do you have yours?
Yeah. So I knew my least favorite right away. I thought about it when you sent the topic over. I was like, I know. Barry Allen.
God, I can't imagine him going for Vent. Oh yeah, no, of
yeah,
course.
you can. Yeah, you can, because they don't stop doing that stupid story. So yeah, Barry Allen, was introduced in 1956, died in 1985, maybe 86. I don't know what month. Came back in 2005. Up until that point, he had a perfectly happy home life. He had a very wholesome backstory. He had no great tragedies. His wife died, but then it turned out she actually time traveled and she was fine. He didn't have it's always time travel. He didn't have that motivating tragedy. So in 2005, when they brought him back and everybody was like, why would you bring back Barry Allen? He's so boring. They were like, no, we're going to make him interesting. We're going to kill his mom. And all of a sudden, his story became about how his mom was murdered when he was a child. This was a retcon that had never been true before. And now he's like a gritty, very fast cop, and he has to figure out who killed her. And that's how we got the Flashpoint story in the comics, where he goes back in time to try to save her and he breaks the universe, and it led to the New 52, which I've never forgiven DC for. And then we got a Flashpoint animated movie. And then we got Flashpoint in the TV show. And then we got Flashpoint in the live action movie. And like, the thing is, it just doesn't fit Barry Allen. It's like you said, I can't picture Barry Allen doing that. That's the only story they ever tell with Barry Allen, but it doesn't work for him because that's not the kind of character he is. And it makes me so mad, and they won't stop telling it.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And it's funny because I love, Grant Gustafson's Flash, the CW Flash. I think it's so good. And it's funny that I've just blanked out how big a part of his story that is. But that and they do try to tell some other stories with him. They let him gaslight Iris over and over and over again. And
refreshing break from Vengeance, gaslighting your one true love.
So what's your favorite?
Well, I was gonna say Inigo Montoya, and then I copied Riki and I Googled best stories of Vengeance just to see what popped up. And I do want to say that one of the results I got was just Aaron Burr. No further explanation, which is hilarious.
That is on this list for some reason.
Like, what?
I ignored that, but
who is the one getting the vengeance anyway? But two popped up that I really, really love, and I was like, oh yeah, I wasn't even thinking of those because they're not at all superhero stories. One is Murder on the Orient Express.
Ooh, okay.
Which I think is I'm not going to spoil it for anybody, but you should read it if you haven't. But it's a really interesting way of, we've been talking about how vengeance is extrajudicial and it's outside of the rule of law. And there is a way in which the murder in this story, there is an attempt to replicate the legal proceedings that cannot be gotten the normal way, which I think is really interesting.
Oh, cool.
And I will say no more. Highly recommended. And then the other one that showed up on here, and I was like, oh yeah, that's the one. First Wives Club.
Oh, interesting. Okay, yeah, because that's about. I remember the first time I saw that, I thought it was about wives of presidents, but no, it's about a bunch of women. It's about women whose husbands have divorced them for younger second wives, right?
Yeah. Well, this is the book that's popping up, but the movie is Diane Keaton and Bette Midler and Goldie Hawn. And yes, all of their husbands are leaving them for younger women, and they decide to get revenge. Crucially, they are not murdering these men. They are just like stealing all their money, and then they use it. Like their motivation is that their fourth best friend killed herself when this happened to her. And so they are using it to create I believe it's it's some nonprofit that's like in her name and is going to help women in similar situations. And it is very much about revenge as like reclaiming one's agency and personhood. And it's also a comedy. Like I said, I like revenge comedies best. And this one is very silly. And again, highly recommended. If you haven't seen it, you should.
It's funny when you say that because it reminds me that how many of I love rom-coms and especially love like high school rom-coms from like the 80s and 90s. And an awful lot of them, your main character gets bullied a lot. And then it's in the process of working out a revenge fantasy against the bully with the girl next door that they fall for each other. And that's just a very, common but really fun thing. So, all right. Well, this has been great. And to our listeners, thank you so much. We're hopefully not always going to be this long, but we're going to have a lot to talk about. And I think that it's going to be fun to explore these. What are your thoughts on vengeance? What are your thoughts on your favorite ways this is played out in stories or how it applies to real life or any of these things? Would love to hear from you. We'd also love to hear from you what are other fundamental ethical questions of superheroes that you'd like us to explore. And of course, this has been for everybody, but going forth, these will be members-only episodes, and you can become a member for only $5 a month, $55 a year. Right in the show notes, you'll see the link, or if you just go to theethicalpanda.com, that'll take you to the link. For that $5 a month, you get ad-free episodes. Every episode will be ad-free on a members-only feed. Most of our episodes will have a bonus content for members. Not this one, because this whole thing was bonus content. And also you get to know that you're support, and you'll get the bonus episodes going forward. It is one membership for both this and the Star Wars Generations podcast. So you get all that content, although you can choose not to if you're not a Star Wars fan. You can have just this one or just that one or both. Totally up to you. And of course, you get to help us keep the lights on, help us keep good microphones and other things like that, and just help us do all the things that go into helping us make this podcast for you and start these great conversations. So on behalf of myself, thank you so much to our wonderful guests and wonderful co-host. Thank you to you all for listening. We have spoken.
Don't stop recording. I realized you forgot to introduce me.
Oh my God, yeah.
I realized this like an hour ago, and I was like, okay, I have to catch Matthew before the recording stops.
Yep. And because on these topics, we are going to be talking about all the things that we love to talk about here on Superhero Ethics. We are going to be talking specifically about superheroes quite a lot. To really help kick us off, I've brought back comic book expert extraordinaire, Jessica Plummer. Jessica, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm good. So really, thank you so much. You've been giving so much of your time to the show. I've not figured out exactly how much of Jessica's time I'm going to dragoon once the Daredevil show comes out, but we will definitely be having Jessica on for a couple episodes around that time. So really looking forward to that. All right, and we're out.
Oh,